Speaker, in the countries where this debate takes place, the countries where police ridicule women who try to report assault, as Affirmative team claims, it is absurd for this team to act as if these vigilante groups are acting in a vacuum. Because we tell you what happens next after they do their vigilantism, is that the men of that community retaliate and beat up the group that did it. Is that the police arrest them and put them in prison for years. These acts are not happening in a vacuum. These acts put women in danger, and then the media will take all of this and make it look as if the vigilante groups are the only ones who did anything wrong, and make it look as if the feminist movement as a whole is crazy. A few things in this speech. Firstly, on characterization, what this looks like, what we support instead. Secondly, on how you're putting women in danger and therefore violating the principal obligation of the feminist movement. And finally, on how this harms the legitimacy of feminism and your ability to get long-term change. So firstly, on characterization, there's two parts of this. The first is to explain what these groups look like. And the first thing to say is that they vary in size. A lot of times these are just individuals. Like the woman in Mexico is a single person who walks around with a bandana and a ski mask. So there are some that are organized, there are some that are just individuals on their own with very little resources. But secondly, they exist often not without the explicit assent of feminism currently. There's often a lot of informal vigilantism that takes place. And thirdly, they vary in tactics. So sometimes these can be non-violent things, but in the vast majority of this debate, and the most impactful part of this debate, this is acts of violence. This is things like gangs of women in India, like beating up men who are accused of violence and domestic violence, or this looks like the threat of violence, so, walking around with weapons, stuff like that, in order to scare these men. Secondly, and importantly, what do we support instead? We support feminist movements in these countries supporting carceral feminism. That is to say, advocating strongly for harsher laws and more policing of these things. That is because, firstly, obviously a lot of bad things happen to women in these countries. That's things like sex-selective abortions, things like femicide, things like dowry killings, just things like other forms of violence against women. And secondly, the states in which they operate often have had a lot of success with carceral solutions in the past. So places like Mexico has been able to reduce violent crime by bolstering their prison system and doing more incarceration and stuff like that, which means that these solutions are something that's perceived as possible in these countries. But thirdly, these crimes are currently either ridiculously undercriminalized or sometimes not criminalized at all, or crucially they are criminalized but not enforced. And there are very direct steps in which these feminist movements can take to say increase the prison time for that punishment and things like that. And crucially, so we think that the sum of this is therefore when you don't have to support vigilante groups, you're able to push for more sufficient legal methods in these places. These are legal methods that will give you far more political capital because people are likely to be supportive of incarceration, of violence and things like that. And no, this is not required that relying on organic change in these places. This is feminists actively redirecting their resources. This is feminists with the international support behind them because obviously the world does not support things like femicide. This is feminists who have far more political capital because they haven't alienated the media in that country. So, and I'll talk more about legitimacy later. So the second thing then is to explain how this is going to put women in danger and how that is necessarily unethical. And this is a principal path to victory. And the framing here of why the feminist movement should care about a few women being in danger is that if they are supporting vigilantism and if they are approving it, they are therefore assuming moral culpability of what happens, particularly in the eyes of the public when they put women in danger. Because secondly, and crucial note of framing, is that if their support encourages even just one more woman to engage in vigilantism, and that one woman now undergoes harm because of the vigilantism that she tried to engage in, that is therefore the fault of the feminist movement because she would not have done that otherwise, and that is a moral harm that they are accountable for. So why is this dangerous and why is this likely to result in harm to women? Firstly, often just tactics require interventions in violent situations. So often this looks like walking into the household where domestic abuse is happening. Often this looks like trying to intervene in it, like a rape or something that is ongoing. Necessarily these are situations in which there is a man who is clearly already violent, who does not care about women, and so these are situations in which it is very likely to continue to escalate when you put yourself in that situation, particularly when you are, say, a single woman against a single man who's evidently willing to hurt you. That is just already a risk. But secondly, and more crucially, there is a massive risk of retaliation. This is what I flagged in my introduction, because you're in the context of these places where the police do not care about women, and so you so what this actually looks like is sure you do the vigilantism, and then the men of that community retaliate, they attack the gang, and a lot of the times they assume that it was the Gulabi Gang, even if it wasn't, for whatever crime that happened to a man. A lot of the time you get scapegoated for that and attacked because of that. But crucially here, it's not just the actual vigilante group who enacted the violence, because they themselves say this looks like putting the phone number of the Gulabi Gang on your Facebook group. What that means is that now when your husband gets attacked by the Gulabi group, they assume that it was you who called that phone number and you're the one who gets that retaliation as well from your husband. Or maybe it wasn't even you, maybe it was your cousin or your friend, but you still face that retaliation even when you were literally not even responsible for that. The most vulnerable women are getting hurt here. And thirdly, police brutality against these women increases. They get attacked by the police gangs for doing these crimes. They are more likely to get incarcerated. Again, the systems are already so bad in these countries. This was so terrible. The impact of this is obviously that the first and foremost goal of the feminist movement must be to protect women and must be to protect its members. It cannot endorse or influence in any way, because when you convince women to do this thing that puts them in danger, that is a massive harm, and also massively reduces buy-in, because people believe that you don't care about your members and you're happy to put them in danger in order to get retaliation. That was so bad. So finally then, to explain why this just destroys the legitimacy of feminism and destroys any capability for long-term change. And the framing here is that you must know that the feminist movements in these countries are often in their nascency, in countries like India and Mexico, because it has been much harder historically for women in those countries to mobilize. This means that initial buy-in is crucial. This means that right now you need the support of women in order to sustain that movement. So how is this going to harm support for the movement? Firstly, it makes the women who engage in vigilantism look crazy, right? Because these are just pretty radical crimes, right? You know, you're killing men, you're burning men, etc. But crucially, these crimes get associated with your whole cause because people believe that, because you literally endorse it, so people believe that this is what feminism is about. But secondly, just these tactics are often very insane, you know, people, the woman in Mexico walks around with a ski mask and a gun. That's terrifying to people. The media publishes it, people see that and people are scared about it. But secondly and crucially, we think it makes the rest of the movement look crazy. That is because people firstly have a very poor understanding of feminism, particularly in these countries where it's so nascent, and feminists don't have the networks to rationalize this and explain why the issues are so bad. People are never exposed to that. They just see this as a crazy thing. But secondly, people obviously have a negativity bias for the most extreme thing. They see the worst thing that the movement does and they assume that that is all of it. If you're not convinced by this, look at Islam and terrorism, right? People in the West who did not know many Muslim people saw terrorism happening and assumed that was what the movement's about. Likely this is going to happen with feminism in place that people don't know feminists. But thirdly, it's just going to be weaponized by the media, people who are anti-feminist, right? It allows them to justify breaking up these groups. They are going to literally use this as propaganda to portray these groups as insane and violent and dangerous in a country that is already predisposed to not support them. And finally, it just takes away the incentive to be able to push for more policing in these places, because it seems as though the women are fixing the crimes themselves. We're more able to justify over-policing because these women are so dangerous, etc. Everything gets worse. The impact of this is that people don't buy into the feminist movement. Crucially, women in these countries do not buy into the feminist movement. That's just firstly because this tactic is very divisive. People will just take a principled stance against it. They'll say, no, I don't want to join a movement that endorses violence, and they just won't join you. But secondly, and crucially, in our worst case, we think women just assume that this is expected of them. Again, we're talking countries where people might not be exposed to feminism, they don't have good access to networks, they might think that this is the sort of thing that feminism is about and this is required to them. But thirdly and crucially, they see the intense negative reaction that happens to these crimes. They see how the media makes all feminists look terrible and crazy, and they are afraid for that to happen to them. They are afraid for their husbands and their fathers to see them being associated with that movement and to think that they're going to do things like that. And because of all of that backlash, they literally are not in a position where they can join. The comparative is that we push for reform. This is something that all women support, but this is crucially something that all people in these countries support. It looks legitimate, etc. This is how you get long-term change, because this is where you get the support of countries. You don't look crazy. Women are not afraid to join your movement. They don't think that they're going to be villainized for joining your movement. This is how we help women in these countries. So proud to be.
Was an affluent woman in her 40s. She was incredibly fit. She was a yoga instructor. And she died mysteriously one night after protracted disagreements with her in-laws about ongoing dowry payments from her family. And her death was ruled by police as a heart attack. When an independent autopsy was funded by her family, which, as I said, was very affluent and fairly influential, was found that her hyoid bone, which is the bone that sits right across the throat that breaks during strangulation, was fractured, and that, in fact, her husband had murdered her. Those are the kinds of solutions that are being pushed for by people who have influence in these societies, whose families and people that they love are impacted by the crime of femicide, by the crime of dowry deaths, of which there is, in spite of the Gulabi Gang's existence, a dowry death every hour in India. Those are the people who are pushing for solutions to fund more things like mandatory autopsies for women who die young and of suspicious deaths. We're doing things like putting more staff in courts and in police stations, not to go out and over-police these communities the way that this team bastardizes this claim, tries to force a silly over-policing argument into this debate, to go out and hear those women's those testimonies. It looks like people in Mexico are advocating for further criminalization of feminism femicide and longer sentences and enforcement for those types of things is people who work within legal mechanisms, not outside of them. And this team requires you to believe that feminist movements in these countries and the world over have like even an iota of influence. Then you must also believe that they are capable of diverting attention and funds to these sources as well, that are much more likely to work. And at the very least, like, to be clear, we were charitable by offering an alternative to this team. We can win this debate if we prove that more women just like die, or more women get arrested and raped by prison guards in Indian and Mexican prisons. Like that isn't sufficient for us to win this debate. But we prove that there are organic movements that occur that do actually get neutered by the feminist movement being perceived as no longer something that was credible, no longer something that could cater to people who were influential within that society and their legitimate concerns. So we explain that this counterfactual will work because the feminist movement can throw its influence behind it, because they are not fighting an uphill battle politically and with perception, because those are solutions that are politically palatable, they are socially acceptable, they can be piggybacked off of, and because you benefit classes of women who would never be caught dead associated with the Gulabi Gang, because it would be social and political suicide for them to do so. You help the majority of women when you are able to actually enforce laws that protect them, have those laws that protect them. So let's secondly explain why that is our first win condition. If you believe that that is a more likely solution to work in those places, and that it gets neutered by the strategies that this team suggests, let's talk about our second win condition, which is that the outcomes for the women in these groups, who the feminist movement has like probably at least some obligation to, get much worse. The point that they do any of the things that this team suggests that they do, because I think this team is extremely cowardly. They get up here and say that they will blast the phone numbers and details of these organizations on Twitter accounts that have millions of followers. They say that they will provide payment information for you to directly fund those organizations. They say that they will provide them direct support and mutual aid and enormous amounts of funding. They say at first that they will allow people enough funding to become full-time vigilantes and be able to support themselves off of that. And then they suggest that outcomes for this group will not get any worse, that they are not any worse than they are now. They get up there in Jez's speech and give us literally 8 minutes of, well, that's symmetric. The feminist movement is hated now. The feminist movement is perceived worse now. These people are perceived badly already, and pretend nothing will change on that side. I think it is an incredibly cowardly tactic. I think it is logically nonsensical. Obviously, outcomes for both this group and the perception of the feminist movement get much worse. So, on outcomes for this group, briefly on this principle. Unfortunately, this principle of self-defense, while fine, I guess, and reasonably well made, does not even begin to touch the territory where this debate occurs. We are not arguing about whether or not the actions of women like murdering their rapists is or is not for that woman principally legitimate. We're suggesting that a movement that has, by this team's concession, a wide variety of obligations to a wide variety of women and a wide variety of functions should specifically adopt this kind of principled tactic there, and we suggest that they should not. If your obligation is to protect women, what immediately happens to this particular group of women the moment that you blast them into additional publicity, make them attract a whole lot more attention and a whole lot more resources? They get immediately disbanded to the extent that they have legitimate political functions and legitimate non-violent organizations as well. They get preemptively arrested, they are preemptively attacked, and the reason that you should believe this is because this team's benefits require on making this group much more powerful and much better resourced than it currently is, which means it is perceived as much more dangerous to the status quo and to the imminent safety of men. So outcomes for that group get much worse. If you believe that they do anything good now, it is honestly better for them that they do not get associated with the wider feminist movement that caters to billions and to hundreds of millions of people across the world. Let's also talk about the perception of the feminist movement then. This team literally says, as I say, that feminist movements would facilitate the funding and defend publicly the groups of people who murder men extra-legally and assume that very little that is bad will happen to the perception of the feminist movement after that. I think this is extremely silly. What are their claims? They say, one, the feminist movement is already associated with these sets of groups. First thing I have to ask you is why? The feminist movement is incredibly wide and incredibly broad. And they are actually distinct groups, right? These are organizations that are popped up in relatively organically in small scale. It's actually unclear that they are so directly tied. I would note, especially in parts of the non-Western world, the association between anything that is advocating for the rights of women and feminist movements as an ideology is actually distinct, which is why it is not a racist claim that feminist movements that call themselves feminists and subscribe to the ideology are in their nascent stages, but obviously women have resisted oppression for a long time. Both of those things can, in fact, be true. It is the specific kind of feminist ideology and tactics for the advancement of rights for women that are nascent in many of those places. I do not think that this association is as close as this team thinks it is. Secondly, though, come on, look at the associations that they describe. They are so much more than that. The associations that might exist under the status quo are like, feminists are people who advocate for rights for women. These are groups that violently strike back when the rights of women have been infringed against. These guys have to stand behind making them like financially, ideologically, perception-based, one and the same movement. It is obviously so much worse. And thirdly, note that this removes the feminist movement's ability to walk back in any instance of their attacks or vigilante justice as well, in whatever instance it might be used. So you totally remove the ability of the feminist movement to say, for instance, remain silent about the general functions of the Gulabi Gang, but when they are pressed on, when prominent Indian feminists are pressed on this publicly, to say, no, I do not support the killing of men if they are asked on it. You remove that ability for the feminist movement to function in that way. Let's explain our claims on perception. We explained that perception is already very bad for these groups. That's to say they get blamed for things they didn't do. So for instance, entire rural villages of Indian women have gotten together and beheaded rapists, and they had nothing to do with the Gulabi Gang, and the Gulabi Gang still gets blamed for it because that is the association of these groups within India. And now that perception and association goes one level up, like that disease continues to spread, because now it's anybody who calls themselves a feminist in these countries that is associated with the killing of men. Secondly, it reinforces their absolute worst fears about feminists and women in India, where daughters are already viewed as burdens and something that you should probably kill or sex selectively abort if you live in a rural area and have to pull a plow. Or in Mexico, where cultures of machismo have persisted for generations, where they will defend those positions with violence. Lastly, even for people who care about women, who for instance might have a daughter, might have a wife that they care about, they perceive you as fundamentally supporting something that kills women because it encourages them to enter into situations where they might be unsafe, either as part of these groups or as individuals, to take radical action into their own hand. That is something that you get blamed for. Look, this was not a debate about whether the actions of these people were legitimate. It was not a debate about any of that. It was a debate about the interests and functions of the feminist movement. We've explained down the bench already why it is so bad for all of the groups involved in this debate. Very proud to oppose.
Maybe white women in the developed world perceive these actions as extreme and as violent and as unjustified, but that is absolutely not the case for the women in the countries where these vigilante groups operate. These are contexts where there is extreme violence with literally no recourse, where the police and the institutions you are supposed to be able to go to seek recourse react with more violence, where women are trafficked, where they are assaulted, where sex workers are murdered. In these contexts, women do not perceive the actions of these groups as extreme, rather they welcome them, and the lack of feminist support is not only cowardly and immoral, it actively endangers those women, it prevents them from being able to seek the only kind of support that is available to them. Two things from this speech. Firstly, on the feminist movement as a whole, and second of all, the protections for women. First of all, on the feminist movement as a whole. This team says, supporting the Gulabi Gang and El Terrero dissuaded women from joining the feminist movement. A number of responses. First of all, as we explained to you at Jez, the premise of this argument, which is that, these feminist movements are nascent and people do not understand what feminism is, actually is pretty offensive. These feminist movements come from the kinds of movements that Connie is describing in her speech. Maybe now they have the label of feminism, but people in the developing world can understand what that difference is. They know what feminism is. They are not dissuaded from joining these movements. Obviously, they understand the feminist movement. They understand its value. It's unclear why they are dissuaded. But second of all, we would flip this argument by suggesting that the preferences of women in these countries are different to the preferences of the women in this room. For example, these women are desensitized to violence. They do not perceive someone wearing a balaclava as shocking and as violent as people who have grown up in a context where we do not see violence all the time. These women are frustrated with the mainstream feminist movement, which it does perceive violence as always unjustified. This support for these groups, which these women desperately rely on, is the thing which incentivizes these women to opt into the feminist movement more broadly, because they perceive in our world that the feminist movement understands them, that it understands the context in which they exist, the context in which violence out of desperation is normal and is the only way to protect yourself, and that is the thing that encourages them to make use of the other benefits of the feminist movement, its other rhetoric, its other things which can be incredibly fulfilling. But the third thing to say is that even if sometimes women are a little bit disgruntled by this support, I don't think this team ever succeeds in proving why women would leave, and those are the reasons that we explained explained to you in Jack's speech and at Jed's, which is to say the feminist movement is really, really important. It's a huge movement. A lot of women perceive womanhood as a defining part of their identity, and it's unclear why women would leave over something small. The feminist movement supports a lot of things all the time. Sometimes not all of them are aligned with what every single woman perceives, but it's actually pretty rare for a woman to say, no, I am not a feminist because of this small fringe thing that the feminist movement supports. The next claim is that, oh, well, these groups are perceived badly, and that is why this loses support. I've already dealt with most of these claims, but I just think that their characterization of how these groups act is pretty uncharitable. It is untrue that they're always violent and always unjustified. They put themselves in danger in ways that are honestly quite heroic, and it is reductive for this team to say that they don't. But if it is true that these groups are perceived badly, we fix that in two ways. First of all, because now the feminist movement explains the value of these acts and the value of these actions, which explains why now women are more likely to perceive these groups well and make use of them. But second of all, by supporting these groups, by giving them more funding, by giving them more things like legal protection, we decrease the need for each individual member of El Terrero to be so violent and so aggressive. Because now there is less pressure to be individually super aggressive when you have a bigger movement and you have more support. But even if you don't believe any of that, we outweigh all of this with a totally non-contingent principle. I know that their principle is totally contingent. I'll deal with it in the second issue when it becomes relevant. But we explain that these groups are legitimate, they are justified in their actions, and it would be immoral for the feminist movement to condemn them. For example, yes, it is true that theft is wrong, but if the feminist movement condemns a poor woman who steals, or fails to comment on the fact that that is justified in a context where other people are saying that that is the case, we would say that that is immoral. And this team never explains why this violence is unjustified. This is a context, by their own characterization, when people do not perceive these actions as legitimate, when they do not perceive these groups as valuable, it is then the moral imperative of the feminist movement to explain why they are justified, and that is what this team fails to engage in. They say it's a trade-off of obligations that the feminist movement has. I'll deal with that in the second issue. Finally, let's talk about protections for women. The first question I'm going to ask here is what reasonable alternatives exist for women to be protected right now? Because if it is the case that alternatives for protection and recourse are insufficient, failing to support these groups condemns women to being unsafe, it condemns them to violence with no retribution. And the note that I'd make is that even if that is only something that happens in the short term, like even if their alternative of organic change, which we explain is extraordinarily unlikely, happens in 10 years or in 15, that means that it's 10 or 15 years of women right now who achieve no recourse, who suffer violence, and this team condemns them to that. What do they say? Their alternative, quite laughably, is carceral feminism, a number of responses. First of all, there is no political capital for it, and they do not explain why that political capital would exist. Women in these countries do not have a huge amount of power. Carceral feminism is expensive. Often they have low levels of education. Those things make carceral feminism and using the legal system really hard. Second of all, though, we would suggest that the institutions that they would be using are really sexist, and it is a huge uphill battle. That's things like police are sexist, the legal system is sexist. Those things are really bad. Thirdly, though, we would suggest that police are from outside of the community. Often they do not understand what the feminist movement wants. Fourthly, though, we would suggest that often, these systems just are not functional enough to be a valid instrument for the feminist movement to use. They want to use carceral feminism in Mexico. The legal system and the policing system in Mexico is overrun by drug cartels. How on earth would it support the feminist movement? But the fifth thing to say is, even if you believe that alternative is valid, it just is not mutually exclusive with ours for the reasons we explained earlier, which is that the feminist movement is really, really broad. It can support a number of things. We think we can support a little bit of carceral feminism and a lot of support for El Terrero and the Gulabi Gang. It's not clear why those things are mutually exclusive. That's probably too late to explain in Brave's speech. Let's deal with what they actually say. Their claim is that, well, men retaliate against these groups and against other women, and that's bad. Number of responses. First of all, I think this argument is pretty uncomparative, just for the reason that these groups exist on either side anyway. And so, if it is true that retaliation exists, we think it is worse in their world for the reasons that we explained. First of all, because now these groups have less resources with which to defend themselves. Second of all, they have less capital to do things like deter retaliation. Retaliation from other groups and from men is more likely when these groups are perceived as weaker, when they are perceived as strong and capable of enacting violence and punishment. That is when retaliation is less likely. But third of all, these women have less legal recourse for the reasons that we explained in the event that retaliation does occur under side negatives. And the note that I make here that is important contextually is just that the police are pretty weak in these countries. This is countries like India and countries like Mexico. They do turn a blind eye to violent groups that are big and successful and that do achieve good change. That's the reason that in Mexico, a lot of the time the state relies on drug cartels to do things like policing, because they're pretty good at it. The state will turn a blind provide to these groups will stop retaliation and will protect them in the instance that they have the requisite support that we provide them with. Secondly, though, we would suggest that retaliation is not the biggest threat to women, threat of violence in these countries. All of the violence that Connor describes happens anyway. That is things like other gang violence, assault of sex workers, human trafficking, and these groups are literally the only protection against those things. If you're worried about violence against women, you ought not be worried about the one woman who very unfortunately dies at the hands of retaliation to El Terrero. You should be worried about all of the other women that these groups protect. Thirdly, though, we would suggest that their claim relies on the characterization of these groups as pretty shit. Like, these groups are good at their jobs, they are discreet, they have training for all of the reasons we explained to you in Jack's speech. They will not endanger women necessarily. But fourthly, their argument suggests that the feminist movement could never do anything dangerous. This team would say that Pussy Riot is unjustified, that the women who fought in the French Revolution are unjustified and should be condemned because it endangered women. Obviously, we do not think that claim is true. The feminist movement or endanger women to save women later. All of those reasons are part of them.
In this speech, I'm going to ask the question of whose support the feminist movement wants and to what end. Because this team is probably right to identify that people who already do, classify themselves as feminists probably aren't going to leave the feminist movement because they do have a good understanding of it. But the problem is that that is not every single person in India. In the largest democracy in the world, there is already, a pretty poor understanding of women's rights and a pretty poor track record in the way in which police and law enforcement and legislatures treat women. The problem in this debate was not whether you're going to turn women off the feminist movement, but how you allow the rest of society to perceive that movement and allow them to advocate for the change that those women need. So that's why I'm going to do two things in this speech. The first will be to explain why this hugely reduces support from people who aren't feminists in these countries, and then I'm going to talk about people who already are within the feminist movement and deal with their kind of wacko principle. But I'm going to start by talking about support from people who aren't already feminists in these countries. And the sort of weighing metric as to why support from this sort of group is the debate winning one is twofold. Firstly, in the sense, firstly for the reason that the support of this group, the support of white society, is logically prior to getting any sort of benefits for women that this negative team wants, right? Because you need the broad support of society to achieve any sort of organic legislative change. You need the broad support of society to do things like pass bills to get, broad support for, any sorts of reforms to, how police interact with women, or, how, marriages are regulated in India. You needed to care about the stakeholder if you wanted to care about protecting women, because that was the only way in which you could get, vast spread change. This applies to the second weighing metric is just simply on scale. The Gulabi Gang only serves as a small amount of people. You ought not care about the people joining in that group. You ought care about, the people who are, everybody in the largest democracy in the world. Those are the people that you care about. Those are the two weighing metrics as to why you ought to care about, support from people who aren't feminists in these countries. So what is our claim about people who aren't already engaged in movement? It is that vigilantism is insane, and people are likely to see it as such when the feminist movement ties itself to vigilantism. And the reason for this is twofold. Because first, let me explain to you that people are going to take whatever is on the media as a representation of the rest of that movement. Because if the media starts calling the Gulabi Gang feminists instead of a terrorist group as they have been ordained by that government, then people are going to make that association far more implicitly and therefore think that, feminists who are doing, feminists who support other issues are probably ones that support the acts of the Gulabi Gang. Not only that, but they also then have to support, and for the second reason as to why this leads to, people making that association far more implicitly is because the feminist movement now has to throw its support behind all the activities of the Gulabi Gang. You can't be selective about it. If the Gulabi Gang, beheads a bunch of people, a whole village of women attacks a group of men, then that is the sort of thing that means that, you're going to actually lose a bunch of support from the people that you really care about in this debate. The impact of this is that, as we explained, firstly, the average person does not buy into the feminist movement, because being a feminist means you're participating in a movement that does go around and behead people. But secondly, that legislators don't engage with feminists at all, because feminists are now operating outside of the law and operating in ways that, are extrajudicial. But thirdly, they're way more likely to, you're not going to get the Gulabi Gang to, actually be able to spread its support, because if you don't have, a huge base of support that is feminists donating to the Gulabi Gang, then what actual impact can it have, right? If people are stopping their donations, then what can you actually do? They accrue none of their benefits. What are the responses that we get as to why you lose the broad support of society, which is by far the most important thing in this debate? Their responses are twofold, and they're both weak as shit. The first one is that organic change isn't real, and they kind of give like the structural reason of like, well, if the government hasn't already changed its practices, then the government is never going to change. But I think this just misunderstands what organic change means, right? Because organic change does not mean that you have to, get instantaneous change in the form of, really radical policy. It is exactly what is in the name, right? You need organic change. That's something that happens over a long period of time with long social movements that are really protracted. They're the ones that have been, historically proven to be very successful. Firstly, to believe that organic change isn't real, you have to believe, therefore, that women's rights are going to stay the same in India for into the future indefinitely. That is probably just very unlikely. They never proved why that was a likely outcome. But secondly, our public support claim here is that on their side you get way less of that organic change, and you get probably a degradation of that at the very first instance because you lose out public support from the people. So I think that organic change is very much real. It was very silly for them to claim that you never get that sort of thing under their side. I think it's probably fine to keep the way that we're going. Second thing that they say is that vigilante groups are already tied to women and to the feminist movement, and that therefore our claim here is one that is entirely symmetric. Two responses here. Firstly, I just don't think that it is true that vigilante groups are already tied to women and are already tied to the feminist movement, for the reason that firstly, feminist movements in India have already done things like denounce the Gulabi Gang, but secondly, that governments have already taken steps to separate the feminist movement from these sorts of vigilante activities, right? Because the Indian government has said that the Gulabi Gang is a terrorist group. That is something that means you don't associate with the average feminist who's trying to advocate for some sort of broad legislative action. But secondly, even if it is true that vigilante groups are already tied to women, their argument is one of pure mitigation. Our argument is not to say that the vigilante groups are not already tied to women. Our argument is to say that it becomes even more tied to women under side affirmative, which is obviously still a massive harm. People don't like the Gulabi Gang. This means that because of the inextricable link that is drawn between the two, that they've explained down the bench, people are way more likely to associate that with them. At the end of this, you ought to believe that side negative takes effect, because we are the side that brings you the actual ability to get widespread social support for issues that affect the feminist movement. It's not about the people that are already engaging in this movement, as the affirmative identifies. This is unlikely to change on either side. It is about the group that is more likely to get the broad social support that you need to actually advocate, for meaningful change within these issues. So now that we've already taken the debate, I'm going to do some margin extending and prove why you don't actually, get all the benefits that they want to claim about, people that are already in the feminist movement. Let's deal with first with their principle. I want you to look at their notes and stop buying all this crap non-contingent principle. We've proven this. They actually haven't, because let's look at what they said. The reason that they said that there is a principle here is that firstly, it's legitimate to act in self-defense, and secondly, the state doesn't provide sufficient mechanisms for recourse when you are violated as a feminist. The problem with this is that firstly, this is a justification for the feminist movement doing this, but it doesn't impute an obligation for the feminist movement to do this, right? There is no reason that the feminist movement has an imperative. They just state that there is one, but they never prove that. Secondly though, they never explain that these specific failures of the government to address self-defense, to address the ways in which women are treated, actually justify this specific form of sanction from the feminist movement. They need to explain why you actually do get, why violence is the one and correct answer in order for their principle to be valid here. I don't think it is one that is valid. So on that extent there, they have not cleared the very first bar that they needed to in this debate, and you ought not give them the win for that reason. The second thing that they say is that women are unlikely to leave the feminist movement under our side, because women in these contexts do not perceive violence as extreme. I would personally note that violence, regardless of wherever you are, is oftentimes perceived as extreme. Even if you are in a very oppressed environment, you still likely to perceive videos posted onto Facebook of beheadings as something that is particularly extreme. So I just don't think this is true. But secondly, I would simply note that it probably is, given the the cultural context in which this debate operates, something that probably is going to be perceived as quite extreme, given that women in India are conditioned to remain within their marriages, which are often abusive. Women in India have the lowest divorce rate in the world. That was something that meant that killing your husband is probably something that's going to be perceived as particularly extreme. I think that they can claim that feminists won't leave the movement. The women that are already engaging in this movement are probably going to not want to be linked to a movement that is tied to killing their husbands, killing the men within their communities. That was something that's incredibly bad for these women, and that disengaged them at the very first instance. At the end of this debate, people are not going to want to buy into this at the very first place, and that was key and pivotal to getting broader change. But women are also going to leave the feminist movement because they don't want to be linked, not and tied to a feminist movement that is perceived as being one of vigilantism and one of violence. Proud to gay.
It's a question of perception of the movement, and walk you through the 3 things this team requires you to believe in order to get up in this debate. And then I will re-explain why exactly outcomes for women are so much worse on their side. Let's first ask this question of perception. The first thing that this team requires you to believe is that they require you to believe that people review the activities of and patronages of a movement that they are either unfamiliar with or actively afraid of objectively. That they are capable of viewing the feminist movement as one that can and does support many different things in a variety of contexts and cannot be tarred with any single brushstroke it makes in the kind of grand design of its ideological movement. And that includes men who, even if you believe that lots of people who are in the feminist movement already have a really deep and nuanced understanding of feminism, this includes men, and specifically in these contexts, it includes men who honestly know how they treat their wives back at home, know what they do, and know that this is bad for them. That they can look at that instance, even a single instance of a husband getting the Gulabi Gang called on him and then murdered, as an objective act that might exist in one context, but that they should not judge the rest of the movement that sanctioned that act with that same brush. And that is simply not true. We explained down the bench that those single acts of punctuated violence sear into the consciousness of people who view things that they're unfamiliar with or afraid of so deeply that this poison tree continues to bear fruit in the way that people perceive the feminist movement into the future, and they immediately write it off, or they do worse. The second thing this team requires you to believe is that people listen to the feminist movement more than other sources of information and ideology in their lives, like media, like other people, like already hegemonic ideological narratives in these places. And the reason that they require you to believe this is because they require the feminist movement to be able to convince people that this is a justified and fine way to behave in contexts where it is not even justified to leave your husband if he is abusing you, in contexts where it is just seen as justified to sex selectively abort a female child because you wanted sons instead, in a context where it is seen as justified to murder a woman because her family stopped paying you enough dowry payments there. And that is simply something that they were never able to prove. So even if they prove that people didn't immediately write off the feminist movement, they don't actually prove a series of, I guess, kind of justification-based supports that they have for this organization. Which brings me on to the last thing they require you to believe. Is the other arm of their case, besides the feminist movement can throw its support behind and justify these positions, is that they require you to believe that they can enrich and empower this group just enough, but not so much that they immediately get wiped out by a state that is still far more powerful and still ideologically opposed to their existence. And that is a Goldilocks zone that this team are never able to land in, because if it is the case that you start empowering people enough to be full-time terrorists in the eyes of these governments, there's obviously something that attracts an enormous amount of negative attention, an enormous amount of crackdowns and backlash. So to the extent that they want to talk about law reform, they want to talk about attention, it will be the wrong attention of those governments. It will be directed to those women. They will end up the ones in prison. They will end up the ones arrested. They will end up the ones on the end of the knife instead of the other way around. And that is very, very bad. You put these women at the barrel of a gun, not just from the men in their lives, but from the state as well. That is not something we supported. So let's review then the outcomes for women that exist at the end of this debate. The first thing I'd say here is that outcomes for women rely on this prior issue, because outcomes over time rely on a feminist movement that is not subject to the conditions that this affirmative team in these countries would subject them to. But secondly, outcomes for women in these organizations often just rely on them continuing to be able to operate in limited functions, or at the very least to not have the hand of the state come crushing around their throats. The last thing I'd say here, though, is that outcomes for feminist movements more broadly, when they want to enact other kinds of change, when they want to sanction certain acts and not others, their hands get absolutely tied. Conditions for women in these countries gets worse. These people view these acts of violence as acts of terrorism against men. They confirm all of the absolute worst fears about what feminists are about, that they're an existential threat that should be wiped out, that should be discredited, that should be abused. Those are the outcomes of this affirmative team, and that is why they lose.
Hi everyone, thank you all for all agreed was a genuinely very, very high quality, very close and very interesting debate. We don't have any general feedback, so all teams are pretty exceptional in today's debate, so we'll just jump straight into it. It was ultimately a unanimous decision and we awarded the debate to side affirmative. Congratulations. There was for me four issues. The first one's pretty small, the next three are a bit chunkier. So on the first question, I want to deal with this idea of principle that comes out at AF about the justifications of why this is okay to do things like self-defense, the fact that the state has failed in these areas, and that things need to be stepped up and put into place. I think AF explains this well. I think it provides a good justification for these actions continuing. But I think ultimately in terms of how this weighs in the debate, I think the responses that Neg gives, it's like that's justification for these groups to exist, but not necessarily for feminism to go out and do all the things to support it, probably does lend some weight to sort of saying this principle is not as important or as decisive in the debate. I think the more important thing that and how to weigh this principle comes from the idea of like just weighing off this versus all the other potential harms that can occur. So whether or not we should action this principle if it creates worse harms means we probably shouldn't do this thing, and that only becomes decisive on the rest of the debate then. But I thought it important to flag how that was interpreted in the decision. So the second question then was what is the capacity for change that exists around the issues facing women in these environments? So the thing we get from Neg as a counterprop is this idea of carceral feminism. So we push for more policing, more incarcerations, better laws, etc. I think what they explain, the ultimate consequence and end outcome of these things would be good. I think there's a few problems with the mechanization around how we get to that and like the time it takes and what it looks like. I think the first problem is the best we get in terms of a mech is this idea, second negative, about powerful people using it to complain, to campaign rather, and to push for law changes. I think that maybe works as an example, whether it reaches the whole law is likely to be changed overall. I think the second thing it relies on is this idea of there being a harm of these groups existing that stops this change from occurring, a full stop. I'll deal with this more in later issues, but I think the way this was resolved was firstly to point out that there is likely to be a marginal or no difference in terms of the perception of the feminist movement based on whether or not they support these groups, given they're likely to already be tarred with each other. But I'll go into that in more detail in later issues. So I don't think that is, I think at the end of this point then, there's no massive change in support because a lot of the harms are already incurred around support. But then it is a question of what happens in between the time of that change. So in between the time where that change ultimately ends up happening, there's people at the moment that are being killed, that at the moment are in danger, and that's how to prove how they're able to protect and defend them. I think there's also some missed stuff that goes back and forth about maybe this policy is bad because it leads to over-policing, but AF also wants more policing in these areas to stop these things happening, so it's a bit unclear exactly how over-policing and what people support, and ultimately that sort of sub-point does become a massive decisive issue in the debate because I don't think either team makes a big win out of that. What I think in terms of change Affirmative gets, though, is far more definitive in today's debate. So Affirmative is able to point out two big changes they get. The first is that they're able to get deterrence factors, so when people walk around with the labels and the uniforms, people know that the gangs are in the train or in the community, and that deters action from happening. But secondly, they also get the retaliatory benefits, which I guess reduces capacity in some extent, the example of stabbing in the knee, or creates more of a deterrence aspect, you'll get done again, or it just becomes like a good retributive access. That person gets punished for the crime that has happened, property gets returned, things like that. What I think all that does then is that gives, and the second thing that's able to do is by having the support mechanism of these groups, more funding, more legal aid, more visibility and promotion, is able to make those two things work better in the debate and therefore protect more women. And I think what that does then is really tie into that weighing that we get, particularly at third, it's just like these are people now that need help and that we can actually help those people right now. I think the idea we get from second and third, the idea that in the long term, if this change happens, the more this change happens, the less this group is required, kind of means that this group fades away as we get the legislative changes we want. So I think at the end of this point then, the capacity for change on neg is, I think, quite limited, whereas Affirmative has a clear and concrete benefit now to the most vulnerable people in the debate that they talk about. What we then do is weigh that against all the potential harms and dangers that come from this process. I think dangers to women and then dangers to the movement overall. And this is where I think if neg is able to get up on these things, maybe it outweighs those benefits, but as we'll go through, I don't think neg is able to do that. The first thing then is on danger for women. So the negative tells us a couple of ways in which this support actively endangers women, and feminism ought not endanger women in any situation. The first of those is there's just a danger in doing this work as a vigilante. So the example of like walking into a house where there's been domestic violence and the risk that puts you at. I think there's two responses that AF gives that kind of get over that. The first is to say that these people are consenting to take that risk, and lots of social movements have the capacity to consent to put themselves in danger for an ultimately greater good. But secondly, they point to the fact that these groups have training, they have skills, they're not likely to be completely inept at their jobs. So I think that means they're probably likely to, I think it reduces the danger in that sense compared to the other harms that exist. I think there'll be more direct responses to why these groups are likely to be like poor at doing their work. The last thing, I think some of the responses we get from AF that like they'll be like discreet or do it well. I don't know how well that flies, but I think that the capacity they'll be able to do it. But the second danger for women then is a worsening of the backlash that is likely to occur to women, to victims, to people who feel like the gangs have been, people who the perpetrators perceived has called the gang on them and everyone else. I think the first thing I note here is that, as Af points out, given these groups exist on both sides, regardless of what feminism does, the change in how much retaliation there is probably likely to be very minimal, if any at all, given that all the actions that lead to retaliation aren't necessarily based on feminism saying we support this or not, but based on them doing the action itself. Probably means retaliation then is pretty consistent on both sides then, already exists. I think then that then goes back to the weighing that we hear from Meg about, like, the people in danger now, we ought to support them. So there's no massive additional chance that these people are harmed, given that they're already harmed. This is a mechanism that right now helps support those in feminism or help them to achieve those goals better in supporting those people. The last question then is on weighing up against the harms to the movement overall. I will note this is maybe where the panel had the most disagreement in terms of just how much that perception would change, perception of feminism would change based on whether or not it supports the violent gangs and the vigilante groups. My take on it was that the amount of additional change is likely to be quite limited, given all the stuff Affirmative talks about why there's already an incentive or a likelihood for these groups to be tarred for feminism to be tarred and attached to these groups anyway, regardless of what they say or don't say. I think the problem here is there's a question of relying upon the media or the government or whoever's selling this message to explain the distinction between why this group is not feminist and why this group is feminist, and why they wouldn't just have the same incentive to say that they're all just feminists, it's all bad, and when we should oppose them all, and this is why, using these groups as an example. So I think there's a massive amount of change to the perception of the movement overall, which then impacts, I guess, all the other elements of the debate that we talked about. I think it being a bit more charitable, maybe that some of the panel thought that there was maybe an increased change in that group, but were willing to trade that off versus the other benefits that were likely to occur to those groups. So I think it changed the broader society. In terms of membership overall, I think what AF makes the claim here that because vigilante groups are seen as insane, they're doing quite violent and dangerous things, that is going to reduce people's capacity to engage in feminism overall, because people will see the two things attached. I think AF has some pretty good responses here to explain the context in which these groups occur and explain why, given context and cycles of violence, this sort of action is not likely to be seen as so extreme and so different to what occurs in the status quo already, that's unlikely to massively change how much they want to enter or not enter these groups. But secondly, there's already a strong established connection to feminism by whatever name or cultural history it has in that area. That means they're unlikely to drop out of that movement and that cause overall, just because this action is already occurring over here. So at the end of the debate, I think AF is ultimately able to prove that there is only a small, if any, change to the perception or harms to the movement overall, but they get a guaranteed lock on the benefits to women in the short term by protecting them, and that the feminist movement support of that group actively helps that group achieve those goals, and that's why they're able to win the debate. Hope that made sense. If you have any questions, feel free to pick to any of us, but otherwise, well done and good luck for the rest of the debate and nostrils.